Hey, Dr. Andrew Hill, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mark.
Thank you. So, like we were just talking about it, I'm very interested to hear about what you're working on with neurofeedback. So, yeah, please tell us more about what neurofeedback and brain mapping, what these things are.
Sure. Brain training or neurofeedback is a form of biofeedback, and we essentially measure the brain in real time. And when the brain briefly shifts in the right direction, we applaud that with auditory and visual feedback. So it's a form of operant conditioning where you sort of watch what's happening in terms of like behavior. In this case, behavior is involuntary, it's brain waves. And you can sort of create this change in the brain over time progressively using neurofeedback. We start with this thing called brain mapping or quantitative EEG, which is an assessment of the resting patterns that one person's brain makes compared to an average population. And it's a little hard to interpret one person's brain because people are kind of weird. So we're using this population comparison, but the goal is not to say, why aren't you average? It's to look for things that are sticking out that might help you understand resources. And the stuff we can see in a brain map would include things like attention, anxiety flavors, sleep architecture, or the consequences for not having good sleep, more accurately, sensory and social irritability, and things like brain fog and speed of processing. So big gross resources are what we can pick up in a brain map. We also do performance testing. So I always combine a QEEG or the brain recording with continuous performance testing or a go, no go style attention test. And both of these things, both the brain and the performance, are compared to age matched samples. So we see how weird you are compared to folks your age. And out of that, we often develop sort of workout plans to go after the brain waves. And people train their brain for about 3 or 4 times a week for half an hour at a time. And you start to feel it in about 3 or 4 sessions. And then you get an after effect each time, and you can sort of think of neurofeedback like personal training for the brain, where you have this, these goals you're going after, you exercise the brain for a little bit, and then you have an after effect for the next day, and you can kind of grade your workout based on how it landed and how your sleep and stress and things are moving. So,
Well, it's really interesting. I did years ago. I was a subject in I got to try out a some kind of a neurofeedback system. Then I remember this is probably going back 30 years, and they hooked us all up to EEG leads on our heads, and we were hooked up to like a PC with some software,
mhm.
and I think it was there was audio feedback. I think that our goal was to get the a tone that we heard in the headphones to a certain or get it to go down in pitch or something like that. And at
Mhm.
one point, there was actually a video game they let us play around with, where you get these balloons to go into a bucket or an area in the middle of the screen. You actually control the video game with your brain, so you just look at it and focus, and you could actually control what's on the screen.
Interesting. Most neurofeedback is actually involuntary. What you're describing sounds like something called slow cortical potential, where you can concentrate and change things in real time. The vast majority of neurofeedback is involuntary because you can't feel your brain waves and you can't really control them all that voluntarily. In fact, neurofeedback was discovered pushing 60 years, like 57 years ago now, on cats. And cats are really bad instruction followers, right? So it's sort of this involuntary training. And I've done tons of work on people that are nonverbal, people that have no language, people that have impaired cognition, and it works regardless of what's going on with your brain to some extent. It's not really a participatory process, but you get to sort of pick goals and then grade the after effects. So that's sort of the voluntary piece from our perspective, is deciding what you're working on and moving through, making some change. I didn't describe what it actually is. Maybe I should back up and um, describe the technique, because people often are thinking it's this sort of black art where we're manipulating brains. It's not that complicated. We're just tapping into normal learning processes in the brain. So um, let me give you an example if I could. Can I give you an example that's either in the, I don't know, anxiety or attention or maybe craving area? What would be
Yeah, craving.
most?
Craving would be
Okay.
good.
So if you drink alcohol routinely, several times a week, after a few weeks or months of that, the brain starts to make more glutamate, because the GABA released by the alcohol is so powerful, it's so sedating, that the brain is concerned about the balance of GABA to glutamate. So it starts to raise the glutamate. And if you then withdraw alcohol, months and years later, someone's left very shaky, very unable to downregulate, to soothe internally. And this tends to produce, even after a few months of chronic drinking, this tends to produce a chronic overarousal state where somebody is really anxious. They tend to crave alcohol because it's the only thing that reduces the activation tone. And it really impairs sleep onset, sleep quality, sleep depth, all kinds of things. So very classic phenomena of using things like alcohol for some support, and then they erode your regulatory stability until you're more anxious, more shaky, more activated than before, which of course drives more craving. So I see a lot of, historically, I've seen a lot of people who get into this condition, and you can look at their brain, and the brain is running lots and lots and lots of beta waves. And the beta waves are all stuck together. They're hypercoherent. They aren't letting go. And generally, these people aren't able to get into deep sleep very well. And the really hard part is often transitioning in and out of sleep. Getting into sleep initially is really tough. So we do a combination of work with people like this. We do what's called SMR training or low beta training. And we also do something called alpha theta. These are different techniques, but SMR is used to fall asleep and sit still and also resist impulsivity. So typically when working with alcohol cravings, you want to think about the executive function aspects and maybe the anxiety aspects and work on those, and then work on rebuilding the brain's like hyperarousal that it can't calm down again. So we would start with executive function and sleep phenomena called an SMR, sensory motor rhythm. If you've seen a cat in a windowsill watching birds, you've seen SMR. It's that liquid body and laser-like focus, completely still physically, but mentally on. Literally the opposite of ADHD, literally. But SMR is also used to resist seizures, to fall asleep and stay asleep, to sit still, to resist impulses. So executive function is a big piece in dysregulated relationships with substances. You often want to bring up people's executive function sort of tone. And that's, again, largely a beta phenomena. And it lives on the strip of tissue that runs ear to ear. The precentral gyrus is involved with voluntary behavior. And if you look at somebody who is having difficulty with decision making or executive function, be it from chronic alcohol use or concussion or ADHD or chronic sleep issues, lots of reasons. But what you'll see is the person's generally making too much of brain waves called theta. They're disinhibited and not enough beta, or they don't have control over the beta, the low beta. And in case of alcohol, a lot of very fast frequency betas are instead dominating. And so what you want to do is exercise someone's brain to bring up the frequencies, this low beta, that lets them sit still, fall asleep, resist alcohol, etc. And most of that lives in an area of the brain sort of on the right-hand side. And it's a supervisor of what we're doing. It knows if we're on the right road. It's reading the map, it's navigating, it's sort of telling the driver, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing? And so it pulls back on behavior that's more automatic or impulsive, which is a part of craving. So we generally want to train up, exercise up this low beta. And so you stick some ear clips on and put a wire on the scalp on that one spot and set the computer up to measure that low beta wave amount, the amount one person makes moment to moment, and also measure the amount of theta, which is that disinhibited, more automatic brain wave. And as you watch the brain, as the computer watches the brain's going to shift a little bit moment to moment. And whenever it shifts briefly in the right direction, the theta goes down, the beta goes up. Computer sees that and starts to applaud the brain. And the brain's like, oh, hey, stuff's happening. Kind of like stuff. Stuff's cool. And then it happens to move in the wrong direction. That theta might go up again. The brain stops getting its feedback. The game slows down or stops. The brain says, hey, where's my information? That's kind of annoying. Nothing's happening. Then it happens to move again in the right direction, and the applause continues. The big trick being we move the goalposts every few seconds, we adjust. So we're only applauding the movement in the proper direction. And again, it's mostly involuntary. You can't feel your brain waves, you can't really control them. But somewhere around 2 or 3 sessions in, the brain says, oh, you want some beta. And it gives you a nice big surge of beta for a few hours. And you walk around after the session going, wait a minute, might be feeling a little different. Huh. And then it wears off. And you're like, I don't know, was I imagining that? That was kind of strange, kind of subtle, but I didn't notice something. And the next time you train, it happens again. So then you're off to the races. You have this iterative process of like gently pushing on your brain and watching what happens afterwards. So you can iterate through making change. And this low beta tone, this SMR, again, helps with things like executive function and sleep architecture. But then with someone who's dealing with a lot of alcohol, there's that, decades of learning around the inability to soothe and downregulate, the inability sometimes to feel comfortable with the internal environment. And of course, we have the sleep stuff. So we would typically in alcohol use a technique called alpha theta on top of SMR training. So alpha theta brings people to the edge of sleep, that hypnagogic access place where all the ideas and creativity starts bubbling up, but you're half asleep, so you forget the awesome idea the next day. You can bring people to that state reliably using alpha theta neurofeedback, where you have them close their eyes and reward the brain waves that surge in this sort of nonlinear, deep relaxation state. And in that state, you're making huge amounts of T cells, growth hormone, relaxing brain waves, et cetera. And if you do even 20 sessions of alpha theta, the cravings go away for people. You can see multiple standard deviations of change in a bell curve in resting brains, going from like beta waves that are 3, 4 standard deviations off the chart to typical. And somewhere around 4 to 6 weeks in, people that are shaky and nervous and can't relax without major meds can calm down at will and fall asleep at will. I remember the first time I saw this, I was working in an addiction center in Beverly Hills, and we had clients with real significant alcohol difficulties. And this was a place that doesn't exist anymore, but this was a company that had both an abstinence track and a moderation track, which is a really hard thing to work on sometimes in alcohol. So I was seeing lots of people at different stages of dysregulated relationships, especially with alcohol. And one gentleman had been drinking for 25 years. He would go to the beach in Santa Monica. He was a writer, so he would sit down, open his laptop, and drink a bottle of wine while he wrote a book or his articles. And then he would go home and be a little activated. So he'd drink more wine and Ativan and Ambien to fall asleep. And he would wake up 2 hours later, wandering around West Hollywood, all disoriented in his tidy whities, and end up in jail half the time because he was, on the Ambien, disoriented, and then, big scary man who was seeming confused. And this kept happening. And he would go from rehab to rehab. He would have cravings. Nothing would work. And he was in a rehab with being medically supervised for a detox. And he got through 6 or 8 weeks of detox. And he said, yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to not drink. There's a brain center over there across town. Could you guys drive me from the hospital to those guys? I think I might be able to help. And he walked into our office cold. And we worked on him for a couple of months. About 6 weeks in, I walked into our office and he's asleep on the couch. I said, oh, is he here for another visit? I thought he already came in 3 times this week. And the front desk person said, yeah, he called up this morning to figure out when you were coming in. He came in half an hour early and went to sleep. He discovered he could fall asleep at will. I wanted to prove it to you. So he's asleep because he wanted to prove he could turn his mind off and fall asleep at will. All right, let him sleep. So it was such a huge thing for this guy. He had to like rush in and take a nap to prove to us that this was a thing he could now do. And he was, about 67 at the time. And it had been about 25 years since he'd gotten a good night's sleep. And a month and a half in, all that beta dropped away in the brain. He could turn his mind off at will. He could fall asleep. He wasn't craving alcohol. He wasn't well regulated yet. The quality of sleep wasn't ideal yet. All that damage, all that stress wasn't yet rebuilt in 6 or 8 weeks, but it kept going and he kept making more and more change and was able to remain abstinent. He walked in trying to think about moderation, because alcohol had been part of his life for decades, but he ended up going to the abstinence track in that company. And I think at the 1 year mark, I saw him and he had remained sober, which was the first time in 3 decades he'd been sober for more than a few months. So it can really re-regulate this acquired problem. I consider alcohol abuse an acquired problem in the brain, like acquired damage. It starts with learning, driven by anxiety, driven by impulsivity, driven by difficult emotions, maybe trauma, maybe sleep issues. But that process creates change in the brain over time. And then you end up with a brain that is sort of learned into a dysregulated state. It's really hard to back out of that without some assistance. The brain doesn't like to recover from that hyperarousal state really easily. So I see these brain patterns in these folks that drink routinely. Even after they've quit drinking for 10 or 15 years, you still see that same shaky active beta if they drank daily. Now, binge drinkers don't show this pattern. So college students, 95% of them will binge drink sooner or later, and 95% of them become drinkers without a problem. They transition out of that problematic drinking. But if you drink daily for even a few months, that tends to change the brain really aggressively. And it's a really hard thing for the brain to rebound from just on time and healing. And so getting some good shifts like neurofeedback in play, as well as other biohacks that might support you, saunas, ice baths, maybe naltrexone or some other mu opioid blockers to reduce the reward nature of alcohol. These are all useful strategies, and I'm not here to tell any individual listening what they should do, but I am here to tell you that you should do something. You should take control over your brain. If you aren't happy with how you're behaving or how your brain seems to be driving the bus, you can learn about it and you can make these changes even when it's really extreme, like decades of drinking leaving you super shaky and dysregulated. The brain is really changeable. Shift happens. You can typically back out a lot of these difficulties relatively quickly once you know how to apply pressure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's when you're talking about alcohol, another situation which is related but very different uh is people who are dependent on benzodiazepines, like you
Mm.
said, like Xanax, Ativan, um, Valium, Klonopin. Those are, the main ones, and there's a lot of other ones. And the majority of people on benzodiazepines are not addicted to them. They're physically dependent, and they may be treated like they're addicted. They may get sent to rehab and detox way
Mhm.
too quickly, and they can end up with long term, probably similar to what you're saying with alcohol, where a person 15 years out can still have symptoms. A person who comes off of benzodiazepines too quickly can be left with long-term protracted withdrawal. And
Yeah.
even people going through a very gradual tapering process, like I work with patients who are tapering,
Mhm.
and even when they're tapering at their own comfortable rate and taking just very tiny little reductions, they still have adjustments to make and go through withdrawal. And um, this sounds like I think it's similar, with the issue with glutamate and GABA and that balance, and whatever other recovery processes are happening in the brain, that this might be something beneficial. And another thing that's interesting is that people going through benzo withdrawal often cannot tolerate any kind of medication. So when you go to a doctor, immediately the response from a doctor is like, let's give you medication. Let's try, this or that, and see if that helps. And they can have horrible reactions to even a small dose of something that would be harmless to someone else. And so,
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So what do you think about helping people with benzo withdrawal and long-term protracted withdrawal?
Yeah, so we have some good tools. Neurofeedback can generally help the system re-regulate. I work with a lot of folks who withdraw from benzos, and you can see in many people the biggest issue is managing the things that flare up as they withdraw. So the pain, the anxiety, the sleep disruptions. These things seem to be pretty common. They're actually really tractable. You can work on pain directly if you have breakthrough pain, let's say, or breakthrough anxiety as you withdraw. Um, what I will say about neurofeedback and benzos, if you're on high levels of these things, it gets in the way of neurofeedback. It actually can impair learning. So it's hard to do brain training on somebody who's on high doses of Xanax and other benzos. You have to sort of be able to have some clearance time, only have them, once a day or something before the neurofeedback is going to work. If you're on huge levels, I've worked with thousands of people, something like 8 or 10,000 people doing neurofeedback. And the only people, and like 3 or 4 people total, that I've not seen their brains move. In 2 cases, I discovered they were on very large doses of methadone or heroin, impacting the learning essentially. And the other 2 cases, it was super high doses of benzos. So benzos can really impair learning. And what's interesting is the benzo drug class in general makes the brain look anxious. If you have benzos in your system, you have these little spindles of beta waves, which are really similar to the things someone feels when they're feeling that friction of anxiety, that's a little beta spindle. You see it as a fast frequency beta wave, but that's what Xanax produces as a side effect in the brain, this little restic spindle. So it's almost like your brain is producing anxiety that you can't feel while Xanax is on board.
Hmm.
So you can train straight through many, many drugs, but if you're on high doses of those drugs, it can actually be really hard to get the brain to start moving.
But
So
but a person who's on a low dose relatively, or even off of it for a long
a
period of
managed
time.
dose. Yeah. Yeah. Either withdrawing or on a dose. I mean, I take your point about addiction versus dependence, right? Addiction requires both tolerance and dependence. And so we don't have probably in this population you described who's using it routinely, you don't have the same tolerance, you don't have the same need to ramp up the dose, even if you are dependent at that point, sort of, physiologically accommodating it. Um, these are things that will change if you can really wipe away the tolerance actually for many drugs. It's not quite that reliable for benzos. It's super reliable for stimulants. Someone's abusing stimulants and you have, be it prescription or illegal stimulants. If you do neurofeedback, you wipe away the tolerance to stimulants really quickly, and also to cannabis. Now, the stimulants in cannabis are not abused the same way. They don't cause the same difficulties generally that alcohol and other drugs of abuse can cause. But they're also lifestyle drugs that many of us take, cannabis, just like alcohol. Um, and you will get a potentiation. So if you're abusing your Adderall or you're on some sort of stimulants that you're getting into a little too deeply, and you start adding neurofeedback, the drugs start working 2, 3, 4, 5 times stronger after a few weeks. And as you may know, moderation requires low tolerance. So if you have super high tolerance, it's really hard to moderate your substances. But if you have really, really low tolerance, it's hard not to moderate. So neurofeedback is a tool where you can wipe away the acquired tolerance that you get. And it really helps in a re-regulation, so to speak, with substances. It helps people get control over them again because they don't have to reach for the highest amount or the continued dosing. They can have a bit of a different relationship with it over time.
Yeah, and that's a good point with stimulants. With a lot of these other things we've discussed, there's medication assisted treatment. For example, opioids, we have Suboxone, and Suboxone or buprenorphine has its own issues of long-term dependence and getting off of it. So this sounds like a good solution to help people through that tapering process of getting off of buprenorphine or Suboxone. But then when it comes to the stimulants like cocaine, methamphetamine, or even things like Adderall, there's not really any kind of medical treatment or any good medical treatment to help people get off of them,
Right.
and not go back to them, or be able to get through that difficult withdrawal period.
Well, of course, you have with drugs of abuse, we choose the drugs, we double down on the drugs that serve some particular need. Like not everyone's into the same drugs. And with the stimulant class, if you're abusing them, it's usually because you're impulsive and or have difficulty with managing executive function. It starts off that way
Mm.
often, anyways. And it's also very rewarding. The dopamine is very rewarding. But if you give somebody a course of neurofeedback, again, you walk back all that tolerance. So you create different relationships with stimulants over time. And you also eliminate the reason people take stimulants, at least prescription stimulants. So impulsivity, inattentiveness, trouble with speed of processing, trouble with waking up from sleep. These are things that neurofeedback usually makes permanent changes in a few months. So on like a bell curve of executive function, you can usually get a full standard deviation every other month with neurofeedback, every 25 sessions roughly. And if you take somebody who's really impulsive and really anxious and you give them control over their impulsivity thoroughly and drop the anxiety back to a natural response, a lot of drug abuse just drops away because people don't want to be dysregulated. They're serving needs. So if you pull the need, if someone has no trouble falling asleep, they're not super anxious and they're not impulsive, behavior often regulates itself because people want to thrive. They want to drive that sports car on the road, not crash through the forest. So once they have a little more control, you generally see people's behavior shifting because the relationship with substances is allowed to shift as their brain changes.
Yeah, and like you described, this is way more advanced than this thing that I tried 30 years ago. It sounds like you've taken out maybe the. It sounds like you do a lot more. Like you're actually mapping like where stuff's happening in the individual person's brain, and then the subject is not having to sit there and focus and make something happen. They can just sit back and is it that they look at a screen and see things happening on a screen?
Yeah. Yeah. We'll throw up like a simple game, a Pac-Man or some picture grid, puzzle pieces that we'll fill in. And the computer watches the brain moment to moment. When the brain briefly shifts or stays shifting in the right direction, the game play happens. So little puzzle pieces filling in or a car driving or something. And then the brain moves in the wrong direction and the game slows down or stops. So the game's like
Yeah.
making audio and motion at you, stimulus. The brain's like, ooh, stuff. And then it slows down and stops, and then it continues again. So the whole time you're doing neurofeedback in a classic sense these days, you're watching games that are stopping and starting. But the brain's hearing, good job, brain, good job, brain, good job, brain. No, good job, good job, good job. No, again and again. And so it ends up being more about, I don't mind this game versus I'm trying to do something. And people often, sit there and they try to focus, they try to concentrate. It doesn't really matter. And then
Yeah.
a few sessions in, they stop trying. And that's about when things start to happen is the brain goes, oh, you want some brain waves to do this. And you get like a day or so of shift after a handful of sessions and you start feeling the after effects. And it's really empowering to go, well, wait a minute, I decided to do something and then I felt different in that way. Oh, I mean, even showing somebody with, strong dysregulated anxiety, I can show you that anxiety in a brain map. It's visible. I can show you your perseveration, rumination, hypervigilance, busy mind, social irritability, sensory integration. It all just jumps out on a QEEG. When I show you your suffering, it's not instantly different. It hasn't solved problems right away. But the moment you understand how it's working in your brain, it's a whole lot harder to be overwhelmed by it, shamed by it, to feel guilty about this thing that's happening. And knowing how your brain works can start to give you control over making changes. So I encourage everyone, if you're suffering, don't just suffer in ignorance, get into your brain, learn how it works, and it will often give you some strategies to take control. I mean, neurofeedback is a very high tech and very involved process. It takes a few months. You can make huge changes, and it's really valuable, I think. But there's all kinds of things you can do once you know how your brain works. If your speed of processing is off, you hack your sleep. If your anxiety is off, maybe you do some biofeedback, HRV or something, meditation. So once you know how all these regulatory resources are operating, you can make better choices to gradually tune the system in the direction you want versus potentially just reaching for the palliative substance, which is reducing some drive of suffering or frustration or something, but it's not necessarily shaping the machine in the direction that you want to shape it. So if you're already reaching for drugs and alcohol, and you're already adulterating the system, well, why not do something to change it in a different direction? Take some control. If you don't mind mucking about with your head, maybe you try to work on the anxiety and the sleep onset and things like that instead of just feeling briefly dull and euphoric.
Yeah.
So,
Um, I wanted to ask you about a few things that are maybe they're somewhat related. If just, we'll go quickly through these few
sure.
things. One thing that what you're talking about reminds me of a little bit, but I know it's maybe it's completely without the feedback part, which is I think a major part of it, is binaural beats. Where you
Mm,
listen to these recordings that
sure.
entrain your brain into like and they talk about alpha, beta, theta, delta, and I do like listening to them, like the delta recordings, and they'll put me to sleep and things like
Mhm.
that. But can that? I mean, clearly that's not doing anything close to what you're doing because you don't have the feedback part of it at all. That you're not
Yeah, it's
controlling
not
it.
actually doing, it's not doing what it says in the tin. Binaural beats do not create the brain waves they say that they create. The human brain does not appear to have a frequency following effect when you play two different frequencies in each ear and the brain picks up the difference.
Yeah.
That is demonstrated in some animals. It's never been demonstrated in humans, and lots of research looks for it and does not find it.
Okay.
Binaural beats is another form of meditation. You might as well listen to your favorite music. The beats themselves do not matter. Monaural beats, binaural beats, it's all bunk. It's all sham.
Yeah.
So if you enjoy a particular Heliosync or whatever video audio, great. Now you're doing an audio meditation and that may have benefits, but I would not spend lots of money on binaural beat software or audio tracks because they don't do anything. And I've done a lot of research in this, both in labs as well as in the literature. It's a non-starter. Binaural beats they're not quite as bad, but there's certain things in the health and wellness space you should run from when you hear these words. One of the words is quantum. Someone's using the word quantum in a health and wellness context, they're a charlatan unless you're sitting inside of an MRI machine, basically. So binaural beats are in that same landscape. The
Yeah.
vast majority is just bad marketing, bad science, and there's not much there.
Funny,
So
funny you say that about because I've found that some of the recordings that I like, they work just as well for me if I play them on the open air over a speaker. So I'd agree with that it's more of a
so
meditative.
it's meditation. Yeah, it's anchoring your attention, which is useful and powerful, but it's not a magical secret alpha track that you've gotten access to that's going to fix you. So
Okay, and that would cover also the mind machines, which are similar. We have headphones and flashing glasses.
Um, AVE, audiovisual entrainment, the light may do something. It's kind of a weak effect. I think the old school AVEs don't do an awful lot. A lot of them combine auditory and visual entrainment, but light flashing, light stim does something.
Yeah.
We're not quite sure. I think the way it can be used is to break up stuck patterns in the brain sometimes, but it's not a very strong effect. And entrainment, flashing lights and things creates some effect in the brain that goes away instantly when you stop the entrainment, and there's no after effect. So
Yeah.
it might be doing something, a driving effect with photic stim, light stim. And then there's good research emerging these days that you can do direct stimulation onto brain tissue using light, using red light. Different frequencies of light will sort of supercharge the mitochondria's electron transport chain and feed it more strongly so it can whip around and make more ATP. So I do think that some of these techniques that stimulate the brain are useful, but the ones that have been around for 50 years are not. The ones that are coming out now that are, pulsed red light or specific frequencies of light that go into the scalp and feed the mitochondria. I think those are useful, but unfortunately, things like binaural beats and most of the auditory visual entrainment devices, they're sort of tapping into a consumer need or interest in a mystery or a magic, and they don't do much. And they kind of charge, a few hundred to a few $1,000s for that mystery.
Yeah.
I'd rather you work with an individual who knows what they're doing and can guide you through some somewhat complicated stuff, because there's a handful of things in the biohacker or health and wellness world that are just nonsense, like utter
Yeah.
nonsense. And they're getting lots of money. Just to rattle off a few sacred cows that I would like to kill here. Um, Blue blockers, mostly meaningless. Blue blocking light doesn't do much. The only light
Yeah.
that matters for blue is first thing in the morning. So don't wear blue blocker glasses. It's kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
And things like non-native EMF. Somebody is getting ready to type in the comments right now angrily that I said that. But non-native EMF does not do anything to the human brain as far as we can tell. It takes an extreme amount of energy to get through the skull, the bone, the fat layers. It's really, really hard to get energy in and out of the brain. I spent decades, 30 plus years trying to get electricity through that threshold. It's very, very, very hard. You can even do like ECT, stimulation electroconvulsive therapy on a skull, and almost all of the electricity goes around it and not through it. It's really hard to get in and out of those layers. There's a lot of insulation. So, um, yeah, don't be too concerned about trying to find the absolute magical best biohack. Just start learning how your system works and make small progressive changes. So,
Yeah. And I think you might be alluding to this a little bit, but another term people hear and could potentially spend a lot of money on different devices and techniques, polyvagal theory. What do you think
mm,
of that? The vagus nerve in three branches, and they
yeah.
each do different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a valid theory. I think it's a bit more complicated, perhaps, than it needs to be for the individual. You can really just think about the vagus nerve being the integrator between the gut, the heart, and the brain as it goes up, and the brain, the heart, and the gut as it goes down. And the gut's beat to beat, sorry, the heart's beat to beat timing, the heart rate variability is the integrator of the descending information and the ascending information. So you really can think about just the heartbeat, the heart rate variability. What happens in the vagus doesn't stay in the vagus, ironically. And you have this ability to train the heartbeat using biofeedback. So that's a voluntary process. You clip an ear clip on and you listen to your heartbeat, mathematically lining up with your breathing, called coherence. HeartMath makes a good device for this. And that is huge. Heart rate variability is a valid thing. It trains the peripheral nervous system. And by doing that, you can train the brain directly. So it's often a really useful technique, either by itself or adjunctively with other biofeedback and other therapies. So I'm a huge fan of HRV biofeedback. It's definitely a legit
Oh,
intervention.
okay. Yeah, and there's a oh, what is it? What's it called? I think it's called Safe and Sound Protocol. It's a
Mm,
sound thing that was actually developed by the that guy Dr. Stephen Porges, who I think is
hmm
the one who described polyvagal theory, and where you listen to over time with under the care of a therapist to, I think it's 5 hours of music programs where certain frequencies have been filtered out, and they gradually reintroduce these frequencies, and it has some effect on, I think, on a bone in the middle ear or something like that, and it helps with anxiety and anxiety conditions and things like that.
Yeah, I'm somewhat familiar with it. I'm not deeply familiar. I don't really understand the theory behind it, but I do know that all the safe and sound practitioners that we share clients with tell their clients not to do neurofeedback.
Oh,
because they think safe and sound is too powerful and nothing else should be combined with it. I'm of the impression you should always take care of your brain and do things that support you. But there's this sort of like, my impression is there's this restrictive, like, don't do anything else if you're doing safe and sound coming from those practitioners. And they think their stuff is extra special in a certain way. So that's my, from the outside world perspective. I've done some of those techniques myself. I've done some of the bone conduction listening studies, looking at my own auditory function by some of those same practitioners, but I don't really understand why they're uh, using that technique and think that it needs to be used in isolation. So that's my primary impression, is not understanding that clinical end of the field, basically.
Okay, and then just finally, some people go in for what's it called? The thing, it's not ECT, but it where they use
TMS?
that's it, TMS.
Hmm?
Now I would think TMS may or may not be helpful. I've heard good and bad about it, but
Yeah.
I would think a lot of people that might be thinking about trying it don't know about what you're offering, and maybe
It's different. Yeah, TMS is useful, but it's got kind of a narrow use case that's been proven out. A couple things on TMS. TMS is magnetic stimulation, so it zaps the brain with magnetism and creates a likelihood or a reduced likelihood of the brain firing in the place it's zapped. TMS works, the literature shows that it works for depression. That's about the only thing that it has good literature for, but it works for about 2/3 of people, not everyone, and it produces a transient effect. So it takes a few weeks or months to get the effect in. TMS is actually somewhat painful for many people and kind of expensive. And then once the effect shows up, you get a 6 to 9 month window of depression lifting, and then it creeps back in. So TMS, I think, I'm not a clinician, I'm a scientist, but my perspective on this is TMS is best used for acute medication resistant depression when you're in crisis to create some breathing room so you can architect other support for your depression. It's not going to cure it as far as I understand. Neurofeedback works more slowly and gently so you don't feel the process, but it changes your brain. So after you do 3 or 4 months of neurofeedback, whatever you've gotten done is your new baseline. So it's a much more gentle process of teaching your brain to change and much less about imposing briefly a state. And so I'm a big fan of neurofeedback, but I think TMS can be very powerful. And I know lots of therapists that use, psychiatrists that use TMS for depression and for OCD and a bunch of other stuff. It can be very, very powerful, but it's definitely
yeah,
a medical intervention. It's definitely somewhat invasive, and it has the costs of being kind of painful, kind of takes a while, and it's very expensive to do TMS often unless it's insurance covered. So I'm not a huge fan of things that are invasive, only because I'm a scientist and biohacker. I want you to do things that are gentle, progressive, and only give you positive effects. So I tend to lean away from TMS, TDCS, TACS, and all of the sort of more active zapping technologies, because they can work, but they don't work any better than classic neurofeedback, and they often work worse, and they're much less controllable or predictable if you get side effects. Neurofeedback, if you get a side effect, and that happens, you might train the brain and feel weird afterwards, feel wired or tired, and it wears off. Later on that day or the next day, you're back to where you were, and you're like, that was kind of weird. I felt kind of wired after that. Oh, okay, let's adjust. So other techniques might be more pushy and harder to adjust as you go. So I'm a big fan of this gentle, iterative, slowly move yourself in the right direction versus aggressively impose something from the outside all at once. So I have seen TMS work, but unless you're in really acute crisis, you're medication resistant, you've tried lots of stuff, I'm not sure it's the best solution. I'd almost rather you start doing sleep hacking and track your stress response and your mood, do some HRV biofeedback, maybe some neurofeedback. Those are all likely to make changes cheaper, more rapidly, in a less adversive way, and safer.
yeah. Yeah, there's also a lot of excitement now of about psychedelic therapy and including ketamine, which is not really psychedelic, but it's available now, and then upcoming things like psilocybin and other things. Of course, where we have the option to not use a drug for treatment, that would be ideal. Especially like I said with the benzodiazepine tapering and withdrawal patients, they cannot tolerate drugs, so we can't say,
Right.
we can't say try ketamine. I mean, we can, it does help some people, but it also does cause a reaction for people. And I definitely would not tell anybody tapering off of benzodiazepines to even consider using any kind of psychedelic drug because that would have a horrible reaction.
And
Um,
besides, somebody who's had a dysregulated relationship with substances for a long time, they have many times there's this part of the problem, maybe sort of an external locus of control, looking for solutions outside to fix the thing. And
yeah,
that means that you might go from one drug to the next, looking for that magic. I have clients who's come to neurofeedback because it's a tool, and then I'm watching them talk to their psychiatrist and shift medication every 2 weeks, looking for something to create some new
yeah,
experience. And it's not that there's something that there's some big suffering they're trying to fix. They're just looking for like the magic or the edge. And that's kind of risky. There's
yeah.
nothing that works that way for people. So back to basic principles, get the resources of sleep, stress, and attention sorted out, and then the other stuff tends to take care of itself. So
Yeah. Yeah, that switching of medications, switching psych drugs, I think is not only not helpful, but highly traumatic for a lot of people. You know, you're kindling, you're traumatizing the central nervous system by here's one drug, let's pull it away, give another drug, and just having overlapping withdrawal and toxic effects. It's really a bad idea to go from one psychiatrist to the next, and each one changes all your drugs every time.
it's huge. It's a big problem, and you get these polypharmacy effects where folks are seeking multiple drugs from multiple providers, and it causes major problems. You know what I will say about prescribed substances, prescribed drugs, especially antidepressants and things, is brain mapping can show you how those drugs work in your system.
Oh,
Actually, not just antidepressants, but stimulants. If you're wondering if your Adderall works, do a map with and without it. You can see it working. It's really obvious. And things like antidepressants, which are hard sometimes to get a good fit with people, about 10 or 12 days after you start taking an SSRI, you can see the changes in the brain that are going to show up and be felt a month later. So you can get an early screen and figure out what direction the drug is pushing you in sometimes too. Or you can
yeah,
look at your caffeine consumption or alcohol consumption and look at real time. What is it doing to speed of processing, anxiety features, executive function features, performance? And I can't tell you the number of sort of dirty mapping or contrast maps I've done with folks where I have the clean one and the caffeine one or the Adderall one, the cannabis one, the alcohol one. So many. And here's one thing about brain mapping or QEEG. When I teach you about yourself using your own brain data, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know usually. I'm like, hey, here's a thing which often means X. And you're like, oh yeah, that's me. Okay, over here, this can mean Y. Oh yeah, I experienced that. So when I show you your brain clean and then with, a substance in it, you're like, oh yeah, that is how I feel with that substance. And it can be really crystallizing for your relationship with some of these compounds. So, learn, take agency,
yeah.
learn about your brain.
Now with ketamine, they claim that one of the effects of it is neurogenesis, where you have the dendrites, the little spines between or the things between the neurons that connect and communicate, that those will grow and form new connections. Could neurofeedback be used synergistically with ketamine therapy to get a better result than you might get with either one separately, possibly?
Sure, sure. But you're remodeling dendrites every day, all the time, anyways.
Yeah,
I mean, if you went and did one piano lesson, every single hand area, every single cell has moved in the hand area with one piano lesson. And plasticity is always happening. Even someone who's in their 60s and 70s is making 600 or 700 neurons a day. So you're not really ever at a lack for plasticity. This is one of my complaints with the microdosing, psilocybin stuff, is everyone's doing it to bring up plasticity. You don't need more plasticity. You need to shape it.
yeah,
I'd rather you sit and meditate for 20 minutes a morning or 10 minutes a morning or go for a walk, which is hugely plasticity supporting, and do some neurofeedback. So again, it's that seeking the external solution. I think a lot of folks are like, "Ooh, here's the thing. It's magic. It's my edge." Well, no, it's kind of a dysregulated relationship. You're looking for a thing to support you, but might not be. So, um, yeah, the ketamine reset thing seems to only happen if you have the infusions too. So
right.
these days there's a big push towards the lozenges, which are S-ketamine, one half the molecule, but they're not dissociative, don't have the same sedative effects that regular ketamine has. And it seems that that dissociative event is what causes the strong surge in plasticity. So I know it's not the same mechanism of action at all, but I kind of consider ketamine very similar to ECT. It's like turn the computer off and back on again to get it to sort of reboot and create some more plasticity.
Yeah.
And I think that, ECT works just as well. And these days, ECT is still done with ultra low voltages and currents. It's a very small amount of electricity compared to where it was, 20, 30 years ago, even. And it works really, really well for medication resistant depression, really well. But it has this, perspective from the 50s and 60s of being shock therapy. And it's a different thing now. But ketamine's in the same landscape where it creates a really reliable lift of major depression. And then some people get rapid relief from the inhalers and the lozenges, but the effect is really reduced in that molecule in the S-ketamine compared to the regular ketamine. So I think it can help, but I'm of the opinion that it's an intervention. It's kind of like an ordeal. It's a shamanic experience. You might as well go and have an experience and have some healing and reintegration afterwards. And now it becomes a lot about the people you're doing it with and the support you have and the after effects and the integration. I think that's more important than, is ketamine the magical thing? Is my psilocybin? Is my, EMDR, whatever the sort of shake up the etch a sketch thing is. I think that the set and setting, the support, the after effects, the integration are actually somewhat more important than did you find the right drug
Oh, yeah.
to,
Yeah.
to you know.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's critically important, and people should never do any of these things, of course, outside of a clinical setting.
Right.
So,
Right. Exactly.
um, now as far as the neurofeedback, like how would I like you're in LA and I'm in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and I know that not everybody, there's not too many places probably that have these brain mapping facilities and people that know how to use the equipment and the proper equipment. Where can I find that, or where can anyone find that?
So there's about 15,000 people in the world that do neurofeedback, which isn't that many. There's probably 15,000 chiropractors here in LA. But Peak Brain Institute, my company, we have offices in New York, St. Louis, LA, Orange County, Stockholm, and London. And about 80% of our clients never visit our offices. We do most of our work from home. So we
Oh,
send people brain mapping systems, put cap on your head, squirt it
oh
full of
wow.
gel, and do a map with you from home. Coaches will guide it live and do real-time data acquisition. And the coaches work with you for a couple of weeks and help teach you to stick wires to your head and set yourself up for training the brain. And we work virtually. Every client gets a private Slack channel, and everyone has real-time 7-day a week communication. So Peak Brain is kind of like the soul cycle model for brain training. We send equipment home, and coaches and screens
Oh,
cheer you on and nag you to do stuff and
oh
help you
wow.
move through it. So yeah, we're mostly virtual. We have all clients all over Florida. We can work with you, no problem.
Would I have to get a haircut or something, or
You would
shape?
not. You actually, having thick, dark hair is the best flavor of head to have a good EEG. Like my head, my bald head, you can find locations really easily. It's actually hard to get clean signals off my head because the pulse moves the scalp, which adds noise, and also you have a thicker layer of fat and oil if you have a bald head, and it creates insulation. So the best EEG, the best scalp for an EEG is somebody with a thick head of dark hair.
Oh wow.
So it's great. I love people with lots of thick hair. It's hard to get an EEG if you have like natural um, dreadlocks or some like really thick hairstyles. You can't use caps then. You have to place individual wires throughout the scalp that way. And I do that all the time with people that have, black hairstyles in the US, for instance. But generally, it's not that hard to stick a cap on the head. You're screwing it full of gel. So the gel is touching your scalp. You don't have to like stick wires in every place. And
Yeah.
then that's the assessment, which is a little awkward, a little involved to gel up a whole cap. But the training process is a couple of ear clips and 1 or 2 wires at a time. So we
Oh
teach
wow.
you to find locations, stick them on, set the software up, get your session in, and then give us some reports afterwards and move you through that like a personal trainer would, over the week.
Oh wow. Like if a person is in a location near you, like say in New York, St.
Yep.
Louis, or LA, can they come in person and do it also?
Yes. Yep. Yep. They can come in. We train 3 times a week in our offices, but we encourage our home clients to train 4 times a week
Oh
because you
wow.
have the gear, you got the brain, we have coaches, so we get more sessions in for the same amount of time. So I have a 2-month standard program people start with. In our offices, that's 25 sessions, 3 times a week. And from home, it's 4 times a week. So it's like 32, 33 sessions. And we charge the same amount in office and home, use the same software, the same hardware, the same coaches. So this is part of why my clients who are even in LA and New York often train from home because they can train at 6 p.m., they can train on a Sunday, they can ask for real-time help, and they don't have to worry about driving to an office, sitting down, giving a report, getting set up, leaving. So the whole process becomes much more integrated into their life, and they can sit and do homework or their taxes while they're training, and then just check in with us later. So another home training, the remote neurofeedback is a big thing that we tend to do. Even in 2019, we were about 50% remote, but during 2020, we went up to about 75%. I'm not sure it's dropped since. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
work with us
I
wherever you are in the
agree.
world.
I agree. Anything that we can do from home is always better. Uh, I just didn't realize that you had this technology to the level like where you could have someone do this at home because
We do.
back in the old days, like when I did that thing I went to, the neuro or the biofeedback or whatever they called it, they were, shaving little parts of our scalp to stick electrodes on.
Yeah, you don't need to do that these days, and we can give you a laptop bag with an entire kit, pre-configured. When I got involved in the field, 25 years ago, you actually need two computers to run one session because one ran signal processing and one ran a video game, and you tied them together with a parallel cable, and
Oh
it was
wow.
like $12,000 of computers in 25-year-old money. It was really expensive to get set up. Now, for folks who are watching, this is an EEG amplifier we use for training. It's under $1,000 for the hardware, and the software costs about the same. So we just lend people systems. So you get a whole laptop bag and you return it when you're done, but it's not as technologically expensive because it's more consumer driven hardware and software these days.
Oh, wow. So people have access to this from anywhere.
They do. Yep. Yeah. If you're in the US, Sweden, or the UK, you can come to one of our offices, get a map or do a remote map and then train remotely. If you're in a different country, we don't have rental programs. So you might have to buy a system, or I can find you a place to get brain maps. But yeah, I work with clients all over the world in 20 or 30 countries. And even in the US, most of our clients are not near Southern California, New York City, or St. Louis. So we end up getting most of our clients virtually. And I do a lot of podcasts, so people find me randomly all over the world, and the top of funnel, so to speak, is really wide. So that's part of why we stay virtual, is because people are like, I want to work with you, and I'm in this place. Okay, great. We learned how. So
Oh, that's great. And I'll put it, of course, in the show notes. But what's the best place for people to find you, like online, your website?
yeah, so we're peakbraininstitute.com. You can check us out there. All of our socials are Peak Brain LA, because that was the first office. And you guys can also check me out on YouTube. It's just youtube.com/Dr. Hill, Dr. Hill. And I do a weekly live stream every week where I'm doing neurofeedback and answering biohacking questions. So if you guys are curious, show up and ask questions.
Oh, that's incredible. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Andrew Hill. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, sir. Thanks for having me.